Chapter 25. I think it was a good choice to put this in a new video. To me, it's like we've moved on from the first act to the second. Chapter 25 is a satisfying turn of events. Most of it is Edward reading the letters he received from England. One thing that Scott hasn't learned to do yet is to set up scenarios long before the event. So whenever something happens, he has to explain everything about it and introduce it and tell us what's going on before he then does anything with it. I'm pretty sure he doesn't do that in his later book, so that's just another first novel problem. But at the start of this one, Edward has a letter from his father, and things were happening there. His father usually wrote to him with the pompous affection of one who was too oppressed by public affairs to find leisure to attend to those of his own family. Now and then he mentioned persons of rank in Scotland to whom he wished his son would pay some attention, and he'd like Edward to go and visit these people. Edward doesn't. Edward argues that he doesn't have enough leave of absence, which is obviously a complete lie because look how he's spending his time. But the matter is left there. Latterly, the burden of Mr. Richard Waverley's epistles consisted in certain mysterious hints of greatness and influence which he was soon to obtain, which would result in a promotion for Edward. So, to cut several pages short, Richard is in Parliament. He has gotten involved with a new political party who were showing a lot of promise. They're playing a sort of risky political game here. They need capable people to come in, and they've believed that Richard was one of these. Scott tells us that Richard isn't particularly brilliant at this, but he's very cautious. He pays a lot of attention to etiquette. The word that Scott used at the start of this was pompous. I hadn't realised he was a pompous man, but that seems to be it. He is careful, he is polite, and he manages to say just enough of the right things to make people think that he has a lot more talent than he really does. It's because he doesn't actually have this talent that he has got mixed up in this new political party, and over the last few weeks their political intrigue has been uncovered and they have all been disgraced. As a result, Richard has effectively been sacked. I think he was forced to resign at least. He's feeling very disappointed, he's feeling angry, he's feeling cheated. He put all this time in and obviously he didn't see this coming. I think maybe we can see where Edward gets this from, if his father was like this. And he has written an angry letter complaining about how much time he put in and how badly he has been treated by government. He also tells Edward that he wants him to resign his commission and get out of that regiment, partly because he thinks they're going to start treating Edward more harshly, and partly because he wants to deprive government of Edward's time and service. So then Edward reads a letter from his uncle Everard, who knows all this now. All disagreements he ever had with Richard are gone. The two of them are close friends. Edward forgives everything because Richard has been treated by the Hanoverian government exactly as Everard always believed he would. Richard has seen the light. He's the prodigal brother, as it were, returned home. So Everard is also recommending to Edward that he leave the regiment. And finally, Edward gets a letter from his Aunt Rachel, who is even more strongly resentful of the treatment that Richard has gotten and how we couldn't expect anything else from what she calls a usurping family. She hoped her dear Edward would follow the footsteps of his ancestors and as speedily as possible get rid of the badge of servitude. She also concluded with her respects to Mr. Bradwardine and begged Waverley would inform her whether his daughter Miss Rose was old enough to wear a pair of very handsome earrings, which she proposed to send as a token of her affection. As a result of these three letters, Edward is feeling very indignant, at which point he opens a fourth letter, which comes from Colonel Gardiner of his own regiment, who says very shortly that he's actually given Edward more leave than he should have. He's been too indulgent and Edward needs to come back now. You are hereby commanded to repair to, and it's got a dash, which was that old system, probably Dundee or wherever, Edinburgh. the headquarters of the regiment within 3 days after the date of this letter. If you shall fail to do so, I must report you to the War Office as absent without leave, and also take other steps which will be disagreeable to you as well as to myself. This made Edward very angry. And here we get some information about him that I feel like we should have had at the start. Maybe Scott feels like he gave it to us, but I didn't exactly pick it up. He had been accustomed from his very infancy to possess in a great measure the disposal of his own time. This explains so much. And thus acquired habits which rendered the rules of military discipline as unpleasing to him in this as they were in some other respects. An idea that in his own case they would not be enforced in a very rigid manner had also obtained full possession in his mind, and had hitherto been sanctioned by the indulgent conduct of his lieutenant colonel. That's why he felt he could take so long. He's been up here for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or 11 weeks. We're looking at nearly 3 months he's been up here, and he hasn't thought anything of it. That's why. It explains a great deal that I wish I'd known earlier. Anyway, it really annoys him, puts his back up that he's got this letter now. Without a pause, therefore, Edward wrote off a few cold lines, thanking his lieutenant colonel for past civilities and expressing regret that he should have chosen to efface the remembrance of them by assuming a different tone towards him. Edward conceived it to be his duty, in the present crisis, to lay down his commission, and he therefore enclosed the formal resignation. He requested Colonel Gardner would have the goodness to forward it to the proper authorities. So there we have it. Having done this, he's wondering, is this actually the best way to do this? Is this the best way to resign? So he goes looking for Fergus, because he thinks Fergus might know what the procedure is more than he does. To which Scott finally tells us, it may be observed in passing that the bold and prompt habits of thinking, acting and speaking which distinguished this young chieftain, that is Fergus, had given him a considerable ascendancy over the mind of Waverley. See, that would have been much better had it been shown to us earlier, rather than just suddenly telling us now when it's necessary to know it. Endowed with at least equal powers of understanding, and with much finer genius, Edward yet stooped to the bold and decisive activity of an intellect which was sharpened by the habit of acting as well as by extensive knowledge of the world. Scott tells us again how bright Edward is. I'm not seeing it. Still not seeing it. Maybe it'll come out yet. So, Edward found his friend, who was reading his own letters and newspapers, who said, "Do your letters, Captain Waverley, confirm the unpleasing information which I find in this paper?" In the paper is an article about Richard Waverley and his disgrace and his utter fall from politics. And at the end of the paragraph was this remarkable innuendo, which I like this. This is exactly how things were written in the newspapers of the time. It makes sense that Scott would know this because he actually edited a newspaper back in those days. So he's written this sort of thing himself. "We understand that this same Richard, who hath done all this, is not the only example of the wavering honour of WVRLYHNR, because they weren't allowed to actually name the place. So rather than doing a dash, they would normally do a dash, that long dash, but because these people are disgraced, this is as close as you can come to actually naming and shaming, putting the consonants and missing out the vowels. See the Gazette of this day." So Edward turned to the Gazette. Now the Gazette is a government document that details appointments and dismissals and transfers and promotions and all that sort of stuff. And one thing it has in here is the military movements. It's a very handy genealogical resource. So Edward turned to the Gazette pages and he found Edward Waverley, Captain in Regiment Dragoons, superseded for absence without leave, and in the list of military promotions, Lieutenant Julius Butler to be Captain, Vice Edward Waverley superseded. So they've booted him out because he was away too long, and that kind of makes sense. Like in that letter, which was a very unfair letter saying that he needed to show himself within 3 days, it's kind of unfair. It's kind of not unfair because Edward had leave to go to Bradwardine. If he had been at Bradwardine, where he was supposed to be, where it was perhaps slightly dodgy but relatively okay for him to be, he would have got that letter in one day. It was only a 2 days ride from his regiment, and if he had travelled fast it would have been a 1 day's trip. So somebody galloping on a horse could have got that letter to Bradwardine. If he started off in the morning, the letter would have been at Bradwardine in the evening, and Edward could have packed up all his stuff and returned on the following day, or at least the next 2 days. So had he been where he was supposed to be, it wouldn't have been so bad at all. But he wasn't. So it seems sort of unfair, but he has been taking a lot of liberties here. I have hot and spicy vegetable juice in a wine glass. It's the best way to drink it. On reading this, Edward was completely undone. Upon comparing the date of his colonel's letter with that of the article in the Gazette, he perceived that his threat of making a report upon his absence had been literally fulfilled, and without inquiry, as it seemed, whether Edward had either received his summons or was disposed to comply with it. The whole, therefore, appeared a formed plan to degrade him in the eyes of the public, and the idea of its having succeeded filled him with such bitter emotions that after various attempts to conceal them, he at length threw himself into McKeever's arms and gave vent to tears of shame and indignation. This is not how a hero of the modern day would behave. It fits Edward, it does, but I do wonder how Fergus feels. But Fergus is a kind-hearted man. I don't know that Fergus is a kind-hearted man, but Fergus has responded sympathetically. I think I glean from everything that Scott has said so far that Fergus is a man to see an opportunity when it's before him, and he sees how Edward's current circumstance can be used. So Edward finds it really strange that his colonel would do this. He believes it's entirely because of Richard, what happened to Richard. It may be, in a way, but not in the way he thinks. He doesn't see any reason why he should be now recalled to his regiment other than that his father has fallen into disgrace. That's actually not true. Scott says here about Fergus, he indeed knew of more motives than Waverley was privy to for the peremptory order that he should join his regiment. That makes it doubly likely that we are supposed to know what's going on, even though Scott hasn't told us, even though Edward doesn't understand. I think we are supposed to know that the Old Pretender's troops have landed somewhere, and I could go and look up the history, but I haven't deliberately because I want to be told in this book. If I had read this book, say, 80 years ago, I wouldn't have known this history. I wouldn't have had the internet there. I wouldn't have had any way. I would have just read this book, and I want Scott to tell me. He's the author. I want to know what he wants me to know. But it does seem we're supposed to understand that things are moving, that the Stuart threat has increased, and there's movements among the militaries. So something that Scott leaves unsaid here is that maybe Richard's fall is actually because of his son. It might be Edward's extended leave of absence in the Highlands just at the time when Jacobite armies seem to be forming, which presumably England knows about quite well. The fact that Edward seems to be mixing with that, and that Everard is a known Jacobite, might be the actual reason why Richard has come undone here. Not because of his own intrigue, not because of his own ineffectual meddlings, not because of his overreaching ambition, but actually because his son has gone straight into the heart of the Jacobite army. We don't know that, but it makes sense. Anyway, Fergus agrees that resigning from the army is a good idea. Well, it's too late, he's gone. But Fergus says, send your letter of resignation and point out that you didn't receive this one in time. Edward wants to actually go and call out Colonel Gardner have a duel with him and asks Fergus to be his second. Fergus says, I actually can't. I can't go anywhere near the military at this moment. But I agree that you should take revenge, but don't take it on the hand, take it on the head. You should attack the government itself. They're the ones you have a grievance against. Edward is listening, and he's listening harder than he ever did, because now his father is angry at the government as well. He sort of feels there's some justice to it all. He sort of feels that maybe the problem is that the Hanoverians are usurpers and very partisan as well, and not good for the country. So he is listening, and then the chapter ends with Fergus saying, let's go talk to Flora. She will be very pleased to hear that you are no longer a soldier in a Hanoverian regiment. The last thing they do is they seal Edward's letter of resignation, and it gets sent off. I'm not going to say much about that, it's all very self-explanatory. I will say I am sort of annoyed with the way Scott doesn't tell us anything until the moment. What Richard was doing in Parliament would have had more of an impact if we'd sort of known some of it beforehand. Maybe if he'd built up his expectations of promotion and how that would flow on to Edward, maybe if we'd known something of that beforehand, it would have felt like a bigger fall that Richard has now lost that. But we didn't know until the moment, so we can't really be disappointed. And likewise, the very fact that Edward is used to having his own time and never really understood what a leave of absence was and what his responsibilities are to this regiment. Would have been nice to know something about that sooner. But the first novel problems, that's how it is. And that's all I'll say here. Chapter 26. This one surprised me. Fergus and Edward go to meet Flora, and it says at the start of it that Fergus had observed with great satisfaction the growing attachment of Waverley to his sister. Nor did he see any bar to their union excepting the situation which Waverley's father held in the ministry and Edward's own commission in the army of George II. These obstacles were now removed, and in a manner which apparently paved the way for the son's becoming reconciled to another allegiance. In every respect, the match would be most eligible. So he'd be very happy for Edward to marry Flora, and his heart swelled when he considered how his own interest would be exalted in the eyes of the ex-monarch to whom he had dedicated his service by an alliance with one of those ancient, powerful and wealthy English families of the steady Cavalier faith. And there we see Fergus's chief motivation for everything. He thinks this would be a good move because it would further his cause. And I'm suspecting if he was serious about marrying Rose, he'd be marrying Rose for the same reason. The House of Bradwardine would be a good one to be allied to, not because he has any personal interest in her. He would love to see Flora as the Lady of Waverley Honour. Influenced by these feelings, the chief now led Waverley in quest of Miss McKeever. He's hoping that in his current state of excitement and agitation, Edward might actually propose to her. If you're going to be impetuous about one thing, why not be impetuous about everything? Just make all your life's changes at once. I didn't see that happening, but I was wrong. There's a bit more banter here. Miss McKeever is preparing what appeared to Waverley to be white bridal favours. Edward says, who's getting married? Fergus is, she said. I'm paraphrasing here. Indeed, said Edward. He has kept his secret well. May I be best man? Flora said, that's a man's office, but not yours. And who is the fair lady, can I ask? And then Flora said, he's married to Honour, so really he's going off to war. But Edward doesn't get this. Am I then incapable of being his assistant and counsellor in the pursuit of honour? Said our hero, colouring deeply. Do I rank so low in your opinion? Fergus explains that Edward is no longer a soldier. Flora is very pleased about that. And then Fergus says straight away, now replace his cockade with one of a more lively colour. So he's taken off his soldiery colours, and Fergus says, give him our colours, he's on our side now, he's going to be a soldier for us. Flora says, no, I'm not going to do that. He's still agitated, it's been half an hour, he needs time to think about what he's getting into. Edward is a bit taken aback. He says, no, I know what I'm doing. But Flora says, no, you've got to wait. Fergus also, he doesn't believe in any of this. Fergus, who did not understand these delicacies, strode through the apartment biting his lip. He's a bit annoyed by it and he leaves. And Flora says, "My brother is unjust. He's so dedicated to the cause." Edward says, "Surely you are too." Flora says, "Yes, but we need to be able to trust everybody who is with us. We need to know that they're willing to give up their life, because they probably will, and you haven't had time to think it through." Edward is very appreciative of her concern for him, calls her incomparable Flora and takes her hand and asks her to marry him, to which Flora says no. There's a little bit of to and froing with Edward saying, "But why not?" Flora saying, "I haven't yet met anybody I'd like to marry." Edward doesn't seem to grasp this, so she says, "Give me an hour and I'll think through my reasons and I'll tell you exactly what they are." At which she leaves. Fergus comes back and realises what's happened, and he says, "Wait 24 hours, a woman will always change her mind in that time." And that's the end of the chapter. This is a bit of detail about cockades. In those days, when fabric was actually much harder to get than it is today, they didn't always give themselves entire uniforms. Now, the British regiments did, especially the officers would always have their full uniform, but that was because they were rich and because they lived in a much more privileged place. So a lot of soldiers, for instance, in Ireland and in Scotland, wore their normal daily clothes, and they just pinned colours to themselves here and there to show who they were and which side they were on. One of the ways they did this was using a cockade. A cockade was like a little badge that you pinned to your hat or your bonnet. At the start of that last scene, Flora was sitting with what Edward took to be bridal wear all around her. That's because it was white, because the Jacobites chose the colour white as their signifying colour. One thing that Edward did in this chapter, in the presence of Fergus and Flora, was he took his cockade off his hat. And that was when Fergus said, "Give him livelier colours," which is sort of interesting phraseology, because the colour that Fergus wanted him to wear was white, which, is not really a colour at all. I'm not sure if Scott meant something by it, by putting those words into Fergus's mouth. I'm putting this image here. It was a wood print from the 1800s titled "The Fair Jacobite." I couldn't find very much about this image, but I did wonder if the artist actually had Flora in mind when they made it, because it's remarkably like Flora, according to her description in the book. As an image, it's perfect for Flora. And even if it wasn't meant to be Flora, it certainly shows us what Flora was doing right at this moment when Fergus and Edward came up to her. And to show even more precisely, I found this picture of Bonnie Prince Charlie himself wearing one. This is the man who, I don't know if we're going to meet him himself, but this is the man who is mobilising troops at this time with plans to make an attack on the British throne. Now, back to my original recording. That one was a very good chapter. He did that as well as it's done in Pride and Prejudice. He's all het up, he's very emotional. I didn't think he'd come to that, but he has. And I really like the way she was able to say no. She understands herself. She knows she doesn't love him. She's not even flattered. She knew he had some regard for her, but she's devoted to the cause, and she's asking him to respect her and her chosen path for her own life. I really like that. She was very rational, she was very sensible, she was sympathetic, but she was firm. Everything was great. It was a good chapter. And I'm looking forward to seeing what she says when she comes back in an hour's time. Chapter 27. This one was good too. Scott has stopped trying to force the story. He's started to just write. I almost wonder if he wrote these later, if it was the earlier part that he did in 1804 or whenever, there's a bit of speculation that it was a few years later, and from here he was writing in 1814. I don't know, there's more mastery over his words, his story craft is better. Fergus gives Edward some bad advice about Flora. It's said in the previous chapter, which it's kind of what I said before about Kathleen, between his ideas of patriarchal power and those which he had acquired in France regarding the disposal of females in marriage, Any opposition from his sister, dear as she was to him, would have been the last obstacle on which he would have calculated. So he's very surprised that Flora has said no, and he's not all that pleased. He said to Edward, go to her again, don't give her time to think up objections, just go and talk to her now. And Edward does this. As he's walking up to her, he's sort of thinking what his options are. He sees two options. One is they get married and Flora goes back to Waverley Honour. He's picturing her being the demure housewife. Thinking back to Rose's song, that's how he envisions Flora. She's sitting in Waverley Honour, he is off doing man stuff, fighting a war or something, and she is waiting at home. He sees that as the ideal. And he's thinking to himself, how could he make the selfish request that she leave Fergus? The other half of this is that while Flora is back in England at Waverley Honour, he will be fighting with Fergus in the dangerous and precipitate counsels of the chieftain, to be whirled along by him, the partaker of all his desperate and impetuous motions, renouncing almost the power of judging or deciding upon the rectitude or prudence of his actions. And he's realising that that would be just the same as it was when he was in the regiment of dragoons. He doesn't like being told what to do. He isn't disciplined enough to just do his job, to realise he's got to force himself to do things that maybe aren't fun, that are just boring. He's not good at that, and he doesn't like to be given orders. He recognises that if he went and fought under Fergus, that's what would happen. Fergus would give him orders, he would have to just obey them. This is actually a sign of maturity for Edward. He wasn't even perceiving this at the start. He feels like he has to do this to win Flora, because that's what matters, that she will be there with him after the war. He's not looking forward to it. The alternative is that she rejects him. With these thoughts in mind, he joins her. She's sitting up that hill by the waterfall with the pond again, and she's ready to talk to him when he gets there. It's Flora who opens the conversation first, and Scott tells us that that's not a good sign, that she feels comfortable doing this. Everything she says makes a lot of sense, and Edward just isn't listening to her. He's sort of saying, oh, but I love you. Edward says, you don't have to answer yet. Why don't you take some time? Think it through. I don't need an answer today. But Flora says, but I have an answer today. It's better for you to hear it right now. I don't want you to go building up something that's not here. And basically she says that Edward needs somebody who can devote herself to him. He should expect that. That is the woman's role in marriage, that his objectives become her own, that she will help him and support him in whatever it is that he feels compelled to do in his life. But she already has this path. She already has a mission, and that won't suit Edward. Even if he says in the heat of the moment now that it will, she knows that it won't. That's not his personality. That's not him. She has much esteem for him, but she has her own path. Edward does find this hard to understand. And I think something Scott did really well that shows Edward isn't really thinking is this was her big moment anyway. She spent her whole life waiting for the Old Pretender's forces, waiting for the uprising that is obviously now starting to happen. Things are moving. It's going down. Finally, this is her moment. And here's Edward saying, let me take you away from this. Let me take you and leave you at Waverley Honour in a secure mansion in very safe England among people that won't understand you and talk to you, where you will be away from everything you have spent your whole life working towards. He doesn't see that that's what he's asking of her now. So Flora says to Edward, I think you should return to your own country. The very fact that he's looking at changing allegiances is a sign that he is not steadfast. The very fact that the day that he was spurned by the Hanoverian military, he's ready to sign up for the Stuarts. Flora can see this for what it is, but it's not that she thinks he's weak. She recognises that he is just clueless. She recognises that in him. He's so much of a child while she is so much of an adult. So she tells him to return to England. You have no place here. Go home. Go home where you're safe. You've freed yourself from every tie to the usurping government. Go and be a friend to the Jacobites there, where you've got your family around you, where you belong. She doesn't say it in those words, but that's what she said. And then she says, I don't ever want to talk about this again. She says that in a nicer way than I have. She also kind of says, but Edward doesn't get it at all, that he's not able to put himself in her head at all. He is not even really trying to understand her reasons. He's just trying to knock them down. He's not trying to see it from her perspective. So they walk back down to the castle and part ways. They take different paths and they're never going to speak about it again. That evening at dinner, Flora doesn't appear at the table. Fergus realises instantly what this means. He goes to talk to her. He comes back a bit annoyed. Of course, he's annoyed not on Edward's part, but because he was seeing great things for himself in the alliance with Waverley Honour. When Edward goes to bed, he's still thinking, maybe I can ask her again, maybe I can find, maybe if I go and fight in this army, I can prove myself to her, she will then accept me. And he's looking over all her words to see if there's any chance of that. He's not finding it, but in the end he falls asleep, and that's the end of the chapter.